It was just another sunny afternoon in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek, until the screech of tires and the sharp clack of high heels on pavement shattered the calm. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association, was on the warpath again. Her perfectly manicured finger was pointed squarely at Marcus, a man who had just pulled into his driveway with his third car of the day. To Karen, this was an unforgivable violation of the HOA's sacred bylaws. Too many cars, she muttered under her breath, already drafting the fine in her mind. But what Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have guessed, was that Marcus wasn't just another homeowner. In fact, he wasn't just any homeowner at all. He owned the entire neighborhood. The tension had been building for weeks. Karen, with her clipboard and her endless list of rules, had made it her mission to police every little detail of life in Willow Creek. From the height of the grass to the color of the mailboxes, nothing escaped her scrutiny. But Marcus? He was different. He kept to himself, always polite but never engaging in the petty gossip or power struggles that seemed to consume the rest of the community. He was a mystery, and mysteries made Karen nervous. So when she noticed the cars, a sleek black SUV, a vintage Mustang, and now a shiny Tesla, she saw her chance to put him in his place. What she didn't see was the quiet confidence in Marcus's eyes, the kind of confidence that comes from knowing something no one else does. The confrontation was inevitable. Karen marched up to Marcus's driveway, her heels clicking like a countdown to disaster. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice dripping with faux politeness, "I'm sure you're aware of the HOA's policy on vehicles. 3 cars? That's excessive. I'm going to have to issue you a fine." Marcus paused, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the cars, then back at Karen, and for a moment she thought she saw the faintest hint of a smile. "Karen," he said calmly, "you might want to check the HOA bylaws again, specifically the part about property ownership." Her brow furrowed. What was he talking about? She knew those bylaws inside and out. She'd written half of them herself. But as she stood there, clutching her clipboard like a shield, a sinking feeling began to creep in. What if she'd missed something? What if Marcus wasn't just a homeowner? What if he was more? The truth was, Marcus had been quietly buying up properties in Willow Creek for years. He wasn't just a resident, he was the landlord. The HOA, he funded it, the rules. He could change them with a single phone call, but he'd never felt the need to flaunt his power until now. As Karen stammered, trying to regain her footing, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. "You see these?" he said, holding them up. "These aren't just for my cars. They're for every house on this street. Every single one." Karen's face went pale. Her mind raced. How could this be? How could she not have known? And more importantly, what did this mean for her precious HOA? But before she could respond, Marcus turned and walked away, leaving her standing there in stunned silence. The sound of his car door closing echoed through the neighborhood like a gunshot. Karen's world was unraveling, and she had no idea how to stop it. What would happen next? Would Marcus use his power to dismantle the HOA? Would Karen fight back? Or would she finally meet her match? One thing was certain: life in Willow Creek would never be the same. And as the sun set behind the rows of perfectly manicured lawns, the stage was set for a showdown that no one saw coming. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. Karen stood frozen in Marcus's driveway, her clipboard trembling in her hands. The weight of his words hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to burst. She replayed the conversation in her mind, trying to find a flaw in his claim, some loophole that would prove he was bluffing. But deep down, she knew, the way he carried himself, the calm authority in his voice, it wasn't the demeanor of someone trying to intimidate her. It was the quiet confidence of someone who held all the cards. And for the first time in her life, Karen felt powerless. She hurried back to her house, her heels clicking faster now, her mind racing. She needed answers. Pulling out her laptop, she began digging through the HOA records, searching for any mention of Marcus Johnson. The documents were dense, filled with legal jargon and fine print, but Karen was nothing if not thorough. Hours passed as she scrolled through property deeds, meeting minutes, and financial reports. And then she found it, a single line buried in a years-old document that made her blood run cold. Property ownership transferred to MJ Holdings, LLC. Her heart sank. MJ Holdings, Marcus Johnson. It was him. He wasn't just a homeowner. He was the landlord, the HOA's biggest financial backer, the man who literally owned the ground beneath her feet. Karen leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning. How had she missed this? How had everyone missed this? Marcus had been living in Willow Creek for years, quietly blending into the background while he amassed an empire. He wasn't flashy or loud. He didn't throw his weight around. But now, with just a few words, he'd turned her world upside down. And the worst part? She had no idea what he was planning to do next. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his living room, sipping a cup of coffee as he scrolled through his phone. He knew Karen would be digging into his past, trying to find some way to regain control. Let her, he thought. She wouldn't find anything he didn't want her to see. He'd spent years building his reputation as a quiet, unassuming neighbor, and it had served him well. But now, the time for subtlety was over. Karen had crossed a line, and Marcus wasn't the type to let that slide. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. Word of the confrontation had spread like wildfire, thanks in no small part to Karen's tendency to overshare at HOA meetings. Residents whispered as they watered their lawns or walked their dogs, speculating about what Marcus's revelation meant for the future of Willow Creek. Some were excited, hoping that a change in leadership might loosen the HOA's iron grip. Others were nervous, worried about what Marcus might do with his newfound power. And then there were those, like Karen, who were downright terrified. Karen spent the day trying to rally support, knocking on doors and making phone calls. "We can't let him take over," she insisted, her voice trembling with urgency. "If Marcus controls the HOA, who knows what he'll do? He could raise dues, change the rules, even force people out of their homes." But her efforts were met with mixed reactions. Some neighbors nodded along, promising to stand with her. Others shrugged, saying they didn't see what the big deal was. "Marcus has always been a good neighbor," one man said. "If he owns the place, maybe he'll actually listen to us for once." By the time the sun set, Karen was exhausted. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the stack of HOA bylaws she'd printed out earlier. There had to be a way to stop Marcus, some rule or regulation that would give her the upper hand. But the more she read, the more hopeless it seemed. The bylaws were clear. The majority property owner had the final say in all HOA matters. And Marcus wasn't just the majority. He was the only owner. As the days passed, the tension in Willow Creek continued to build. Marcus remained silent, refusing to engage with the rumors or the speculation. He went about his business as usual, waving to neighbors and mowing his lawn like nothing had changed. But his silence only added to the mystery. What was he planning? Was he going to dissolve the HOA, take over as president? Or was he waiting for Karen to make the next move? Karen, for her part, was running out of options. She'd tried everything, appealing to the neighbors, consulting lawyers, even reaching out to the local news. But no one seemed willing to take her side. Even her closest allies were starting to waver. "Maybe it's time to let it go," one friend suggested. "Marcus hasn't done anything wrong. Maybe he'll be a better leader than we think." But Karen couldn't let it go. For her, this wasn't just about the HOA. It was about control, about power, and she wasn't ready to give that up. Then, one evening, as Karen was scrolling, through her emails she found it. A message from an anonymous sender with the subject line, "You're not the only one who's worried." The email contained a single attachment, a scanned document titled, "Proposed Changes to HOA Bylaws." Karen's heart raced as she opened it. The document outlined a series of sweeping changes, from increased dues to stricter enforcement of rules And at the bottom, in bold letters, was a signature, Marcus Johnson. Karen's hand shook as she read through the proposal. This was it, the proof she needed to show everyone what Marcus was really planning. But as she reached the final page, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. The changes weren't just about the HOA, they were about her. Specifically, they included a clause that would remove her from her position as HOA president and bar her from holding any leadership role in the future. She slammed her laptop shut, her mind racing. Marcus wasn't just trying to take over he was trying to destroy her, and he was doing it in the most public, humiliating way possible. But Karen wasn't going down without a fight. If Marcus wanted a war, she'd give him one. The next morning, Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. She didn't know how many people would show up, but she didn't care. This was her last chance to turn the tide, to convince her neighbors that Marcus was a threat. As she stood at the front of the community center, clutching the printed proposal in her hands, she scanned the room. The seats were filled with familiar faces, some curious, some skeptical, some outright hostile. And then, in the back of the room, she saw him. Marcus, leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching her with that same unreadable expression. Karen took a deep breath and began to speak. "I know some of you think I'm overreacting," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "But what I'm about to show you will prove that Marcus Johnson is not the man you think he is." She held up the proposal, her hands trembling slightly. "This is his plan for our neighborhood. Higher dues, stricter rules, and the removal of anyone who dares to stand up to him. Is this really what we want for Willow Creek?" The room erupted, in murmurs, some of shock, some of disbelief. Karen glanced at Marcus, expecting to see anger or frustration. But instead, he was smiling. That same faint, knowing smile that had haunted her since their first confrontation. And as the noise in the room grew louder, Marcus stepped forward, raising his hand for silence. "Thank you, Karen," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I was wondering when you'd bring this up." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. "But before we discuss the proposal, there's something you should know." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. "This contains all the evidence of your misconduct as HOA president. The favoritism, the misuse of funds, the harassment of neighbors who didn't follow your rules. Shall I play it for everyone?" Karen's heart stopped. Her mouth went dry. She wanted to scream, to protest, to deny everything. But the look in Marcus's eyes told her it was too late. He had her cornered. And as the room erupted into chaos, Karen realized that this wasn't just a battle for control of the HOA. It was a battle for her reputation, her future, her very place in the neighborhood she'd fought so hard to protect. But Marcus wasn't done. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "This isn't just about Karen. It's about all of us, about what kind of community we want to be. And I think it's time for a change." The room fell silent. Again, the weight of his words sinking in. Karen stood frozen, her mind racing. What was he going to do? What was he going to say? And more importantly, what was going to happen to her? But before Marcus could continue, a loud crash echoed through the room. The door flew open, and a man burst in, his face pale, his eyes wide with panic. "You need to come outside," he said, his voice shaking. "Right now." Everyone turned, the tension in the room reaching a breaking point. What was going on? What had happened? And as the crowd rushed toward the door, Karen and Marcus exchanged one last glance. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning.